Welcome to the Final Girls podcast. I'm Anna Bogutska, and as ever, I'm your podcast host. We are in a little bit of a hiatus right now, coming back early next year with our new full season. But in the meantime, if you are missing the Final Girls horror coverage, you can find so much more of that over on our Patreon page at patreon.com/the Final Girls. You'll find in-depth review of new releases, deep dive conversations, and generally just bonus goodness. So if you're willing to support or you want to gift it to someone in your life who has a penchant for horror films, you know where to go. But for now, I'm extremely thrilled to drop this bonus episode celebrating the newly released film Nanny, which is now available on Amazon Prime to stream. And I sat down with Nanny's writer-director Nikyatu Jusu and her leading lady Anna Diop to talk about the making of the film. They were here when Nanny premiered at the London Film Festival back in October, and within one day I had the absolute privilege of speaking to the both of them. And without exaggerating, both of these interviews are probably some of my favorite conversations I've had this year. Now, we don't fully go into spoilers, we don't reveal anything that actually happens in the film, but we discuss the film broadly in case that's a deterrent for you. And if it is, I do encourage you to find and watch the film on Amazon Prime. It is glorious. It's one of the most beautifully shot films I've seen all year. It seeps under your skin, and if that is not enough of a recommendation, I don't know what is. Check it out. And after you watch it, there is a deep dive review of the film over on the Final Girls Patreon feed. And with all of that said, please enjoy my conversation with Nikyatu Jusu and Anna Diop. Thank you so much for your film and for taking the time to speak to me. I've been looking forward to this.
I'm very happy to be here.
I wanted to start, first of all, by asking you about your own personal relationship with horror films.
You know, I wouldn't say that I initially fell in love with horror outright. It was more so the darker genres in general. Suspense, thriller, psychological thriller, psychosexual thriller. Like, I just love the darker genres in general. And growing up, I grew up in a multi-generational household where we would just watch movies. Like, it would be me, my cousins, my uncle, my mom, my dad, my brother, and we would just watch kind of dark stuff as a family. I remember falling in love with the era of Death Becomes Her, Basic Instinct, Single White Female. But also, of course, like Freddy Krueger and the traditional, stereotypical American, like, darker genre stuff. And I love women protagonists, La Femme Nikita, like action, international films with a woman in the lead who is killing people, you know? I love that too. I'm interested in violent femme fatales who are either running away from themselves or running away from something tangible.
So with that in mind, I wanted to ask you kind of about the origin story of Nanny.
Yeah.
Definitely not a femme fatale, but
yeah.
What was the beginning of Nanny? Was it a particular scene? Was it a character? Was it this might sound weird, but was it a color? Because I'm going to ask you about color. No, it doesn't
sound weird. I think that's a very intuitive question to ask. So the origin was loosely my mother's story. I'm first gen American. My family's from Sierra Leone, West Africa. My mom did some domestic work growing up. When I was growing up, she did some domestic work, but she also owned a business and self-published 2 novels and had dreams of her own. And I was always fiercely protective of my mother. She's my best friend. So when she would go into people's homes to do this work in between jobs, I was always just really worried about her. Like, how was she being treated? Who were these people? And when you're a kid, you don't have the power or the agency to protect your own parents. But I had this fierce protection over her. And so the germ of the idea started when I actually got to NYU. So I went straight from undergrad, went to NYU grad, took no breaks. I'm probably going to have a nervous breakdown in my 50s. Like, I've been working nonstop. But I got to NYU, and in that area, I don't know if you've been to the Tisch area, like Broadway, West 4th area, literally saw all these Black and brown women pushing mostly white children in strollers. And I was like, oh my God, this is literally the visual manifestation of, you know, what I knew my mom and other women did. But like in New York, everything is on the surface. It's not hidden. And so I started to write the script, just the outline. But I knew I didn't want it to be a straightforward drama. I wanted my protagonist to have sensuality and agency and power. And because of the baseline question that you asked me about the films that I was intrigued by. But I also wanted to introduce fantasy and magic and folklore. So I started to tap into, it's hard to research folklore that is not centered, you know, and from cultures that are not centered. But luckily, working in academia as an assistant professor, I have access to the archive of JSTOR. And so I started doing all this research, pulling information about Anansi the spider and Mami Wata. And those are the two figures I settled on because, one, on a spiritual level, they're two very prevalent forms of resistance for African diasporic people. Two, I love chaos agents. I love figures that say, let's burn this shit down. Even if I burn myself in the process, we need to start from scratch. I don't like when the oppressed are told how to be oppressed. You know, we live in a society that says nonviolence, civility, respectability. And that's really convenient when you're on the other side and you're being served. But when you are the oppressed, you know, violence has to be fought with violence. So I've been curious about these figures, and Mami Wata is a cunning, sensual, sexual, queer figure who also represents capitalism. So these were two figures I wanted to introduce, but on a more superficial level, I knew they would be fun to introduce in a live action form, like just visually, aesthetically, colorscape, soundscape. What do they sound like? What does Mami Wata sound like? What does a mermaid sound like? What do dolphins sound like? Like pulling from nature. And, you know, our budget was limited. So Anansi, the spider, initially I conceived of him as this massive spider figure. But you know, ultimately with the constraints, it made sense to lean into the naturalness of an actual spider. Mm-hmm. So those were the things that I was thinking about over the course of creating this project.
And can you expand a little bit about the stylistic choices that you were thinking about when building in not just these two figures, but imagery that from your research through all of these choices that I could feel? Obviously, I'm not going to understand them intellectually, but I understood them emotionally. Kind of the sounds, the oppressiveness of the soundscape, the consistent color schemes, like they all struck me as very, very specific choices that were creating a palette of a folklore mixed with the immigrant experience that I've not seen and that I haven't seen in any other horror film of this kind.
You, Anna.
So could you talk a little bit about kind of building essentially a visual language that has, you know, maybe it's my own ignorance, but doesn't exist.
You know,
exists very rarely.
My influences are very diverse in terms of mediums, but also film, like the filmmakers within film, Park Chan-wook, you know, Lynn Ramsey, Andrea Arnold, Michael Haneke, Usman Semben. So I have this really diverse frame of reference for the types of filmmakers I admire. And what they have in common, even though they're all very different from one another, is that within their work, within one film, you might have 5 genres. So for instance, Park Chan-wook, my introduction to his work was Old Boy. Within Old Boy, you have a family drama, you have action, you have thriller, you have horror, you have sexuality. And so I feel like I got permission from the filmmakers I started to consume in film school to make a film that couldn't be easily pigeonholed. But also color-wise, like Miranire, I saw Monsoon Wedding, and I remember thinking, wow, like these are the colors I grew up with as a Sierra Leonean American. We would have parties and people wore the fabrics and the colors and the textures. So even though color saturation is not something that is thought of as like part of horror, I knew that I would still wanted elements of my culture to bring into the horror paradigm. And then once we started hiring our department heads, brilliant people, Rena Yang, our DP, who's based here, who's from here.
Oh, I know.
Japanese, British. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Rena is a genius.
I know. I've been admiring her work since her short films.
She's brilliant. And I was so thankful that she chose us back because, she's the DP, and then the production designer, Jonathan Guggenheim, also brilliant, and Charlize Antoinette, our costume design lead. So all of us fought for the time to plan together, and to really sit and talk about color palette. And Jonathan really leaned into a lagoon, aqua landscape because we're navigating Mami Wata. We're navigating this water motif. What does that mean? What does it look like in Amy and Adam's space versus Aisha's space? Amy and Adam's space is very sterile, clinical. Like they're pantomiming being cultured. They have these images and these things that feel that like they should be warm, but they're not. Like it's lacking soul. And then Charlize really leaned into yellows and oranges when Aisha's in her community. Warm colors because she's embraced by the warmth of her people. So it was a conversation that we all had the time to talk about. And when you can tell when a filmmaker has taken the time for people to communicate amongst departments because things feel cohesive on the screen as opposed to these different cogs in the machine working individually. So it was really a collective effort of just an amazing team.
And I'm really glad you brought up kind of the water motif because I wanted to specifically ask you about that. What does water represent in the world that you all collectively build in Nanny?
Water is important to me, even outside of Nanny. It's just, how intuitively, innately, there are elements that you have an affinity for, and you don't know why yet, or you don't understand why until maybe you get older and you start to pursue knowledge. And getting older and consuming knowledge, I realized how prevalent water has been in the African diaspora in terms of when the ships came and, whisked us from the continent or from our different lands to the Americas and to these different European nations. People would literally fling themselves over the ship, throw themselves into the water and commit suicide rather than be enslaved, and some people were thrown overboard, whether they were sick slaves or just, we have a really convoluted history with water. And so I remember reading about some fable about the people who jumped into the water instead of being enslaved, created this whole marine kingdom, of free Black people at the bottom of the sea. So things like that are things that I thought about. Water represents birth, rebirth, destruction, renewal. It's just such a complicated element. But it's one of the elements that takes up the majority of Earth. And it's a space that we still don't understand. We don't know the depths. We can't go there for a reason. And that's probably what is saving the depths of the ocean, is that humans literally cannot go and destroy it. So it's interesting. It's compelling to me.
And I wanted to ask you as well, perhaps this is a slightly loaded question because it's your film, but one of the things I personally love about horror films is how everybody can take away something to be afraid of without even knowing what they're going into, that something will stick. And I wonder kind of from your perspective, when you're making this film, when you were writing it, kind of what for you is the true horror of Nanny?
That's a good question. And you said the answer in the question that I would agree with is that the beauty of elevated horror, even the opposite, whatever the opposite of elevated horror is, you can always interpret the monster based on your life, whether the monster is grief or trauma or a physical manifestation of someone. The beauty of horror is that it's open to interpretation. And for characters like Aisha, there are so many forces of horror in an African woman's life coming to a country like America, or any country, any white supremacist settler nation. For an African woman, I think African women, Black women, are some of the most vulnerable people on earth because of the intersection of all of these elements that we are oppressed by: womanhood, Blackness, et cetera, et cetera. And so for someone like Aisha, the horror is almost everywhere, whether she's being sexualized, whether she's being underpaid. It's really complicated, really having agency as a Black woman. But the beauty of Black womanhood is that we've nurtured our own communities. We lift each other up. We find our spaces. We find our tribes. And I never want to create a Black woman protagonist who is powerless or a victim of her circumstances, because I just know too many powerful Black women. So for me, that the navigating horror with a Black woman protagonist is kind of tricky, because she has to be a final girl for me. She has to survive this. She has to be the last person standing. I never want to create a Black woman in a world, in my cinematic worlds, where she's, at the end, she's, you know, bloodied and battered and beaten. So it's fitting that I would have an interview with Final Girl, because it's really important for me to have final girls at the end of my films.
And I wanted to kind of, as a follow-up to what you've just been talking about, kind of what is the cinematic world that you've been building? And I want to put two questions in there. Do you see yourself working in the genre space for, you know, for your next projects that you might be working on? And kind of what does that cinematic world look like for you?
I definitely want to stay in genre. And luckily, the next couple of projects that I'm lining up are still within the horror genre. So that's the good news. And I'm interested in navigating body horror. You know, I'm interested.
I got very excited. I couldn't even hide it.
And I never thought, I've enjoyed somebody, like I love Cronenberg's work. I think Coralie Farrago, what's her name? Did I say her name properly? Revenge. Yeah. Was I loved that film, you know. I never thought that I would want to create it's delicate with a Black woman lead in a body horror, because you never want to re-traumatize an audience that has already gone through so much in real life. But body horror is something that I'll be navigating next, and also vampires. So,
which you worked on, kind of explored already with your short film.
Suicide by Sunlight. Yes, yeah. So I love creature creation. I love VFX. I love the process. I want to get better and better at navigating. It's a very, as you already know, male-led, part of the process. And sometimes you work with VFX teams where you're lucky if you see a single woman VFX artist. Most of the women that I've encountered in the VFX space so far are, the assistants or the secretaries, and so it's a different language with a totally different team that is not only very male, but is also very white. And they don't always understand like skin tones. And if you have something happening beneath the skin of someone my complexion, you can't use a skin tone that's too silvery. Otherwise the skin will look ashen. Like, it's little nuances with color that go back to color. So I want to continue to expand my language in that realm, and also expand my ability to communicate to teams like that. So yeah.
I'm glad to hear that. And obviously, clearly very excited about both body horror and vampires. But I did, going back to Nanny specifically, you kind of mentioned Aisha's employers, and there's something about their space.
Yeah.
But specifically about the use of artwork that's kind of signaled very, very clearly in the film for me. Both the painting that she sees in Malik's grandmother's house, and the photograph of the young activist with the flames behind him in the film. And so deliberately, I think, spend so much time talking and referencing these images within the film. Now, what is their significance within the world of Nanny, of, the images within images that we're seeing?
Thank you for that. I think I'm starting to realize that they scheduled the best meetings for last, because they know I'm moody and I'm tired, and it's someone who's actually going to ask questions that get me excited again.
I appreciate that.
So, yeah, like you said, it's imagery within imagery. It's a microcosm of the film. Photojournalism is intriguing to me. And most of the people who make money in photojournalism are white men. And they travel to these war zones with Black and brown people. And they make pretty good money documenting pain and trauma and bringing it back in a really superficial way. And some of them are really affected by it. I remember going down a rabbit hole of a photojournalist who ultimately, I think, trigger warning, took his own life as a result of everything he was consuming and photographing, and not being able to what's the word? Not being able to change the destiny of the people who ultimately died.
The powerlessness of just being an observant.
Yeah. And so I don't want to dehumanize these white men, but there is something to be said about a whole industry that thrives off of Black and brown trauma. And so Adam makes pretty good money documenting this stuff and bringing it back. And to have this woman in your own home who wants to get justifiable pay and sees a reflection of herself in his office every day, I think there are just layers of commentary there.
And there's quite a few questions that I would love to ask you that are so specific to the film. I wanted to ask you specifically about Aisha and the isolation and the longing that she goes throughout the film. Just so, I think for me, was the emotional arc of the film. But then I wanted to specifically ask you about the choice of lessening that with a love story in the middle of a horror movie. Yeah.
These questions are so good, Anna. I almost called you Anna. I just know what I grew up watching. Like when we're young, we're a lot more forgiving. Everything is new. Everything is exciting. And the things that you were able to lose yourself in as an adult, you can no longer overlook, and I just realized at some point I had to create the thing I wanted to see. Like I'm fatigued of seeing Black women characters who are solely existing in a piece to supplement white people's character arcs. That's one. And two, once a Black woman is centered, she's loveless. She's made sexless and loveless. And then three, it's like you don't want, even though horror is inherently about conflict and trauma, you still don't want to relentlessly traumatize your Black. Like, I'm just very sensitive to all of these things. So I was like, I got permission from Park Chan-wook and Lynn Ramsey and the people I mentioned, Claire Denis, to just give my character what I want her to have within one film. So I felt like she deserved that joy.
And in the way that it's framed as well, I said the same thing to Anna before. I was worried.
Yeah,
that he was
that's
bad
good.
News.
I like that. Everybody says that, and I love that because I never want the audience to get complacent.
I've been primed to expect the worst from men in general, but also from men in horror movies.
Same.
And I wanted to ask you as well about Aisha's relationship to the magic and the folklore that you've alluded to, and then clearly informed your research in writing this. Can you talk a little bit about the choice of making her your central character, someone who doesn't believe, but also is a non-believer from a place of respect, which I found to be quite a curious choice, that she sees it. She's experiencing things that are otherworldly and scary.
Yeah.
but at no point does she go through the motions that we see a lot in horror films of, oh, I'm going to go to a big old book and find out what this means.
Listen, you know what? I will admit in earlier drafts, I was, there's no film that is so, it's very rare to make a film where no one else has a say in the output, in the product. It's other people's money, unless you're independently wealthy and your father can finance your film or your mom can finance your film. That's very rare. So part of the journey was meeting our producing partners where they were. Like, how can we educate the audience? And it's a tricky balance because I know that a lot of people don't know a lot about Anansi and Mami Wata, but at the same time, I don't like to spoon feed the audience. So I did have early drafts where it was like, okay, maybe she not literally goes to a library, but something like that. Yeah. And then it was just like, this is not organic to me or this story. And the reality is, I'm sure Anna talked about this with you, but a lot of West Africans don't have reverence for, like, they see this as like blasphemous, tapping into the spirits and talking about Mami Wata and Anansi because of colonialism, because of how much Christianity has penetrated the continent. Some people feel like this is really like satanic. And I know when it starts streaming that there's going to be some pushback from some Africans that are like, how dare she? Which is interesting, right?
Yeah.
But for Aisha, I think she's somewhere in the middle where she's been indoctrinated to believe that this stuff is wrong or it's mumbo jumbo, like somebody said in an actual review, that this was supernatural mumbo jumbo.
Seriously. I haven't read any reviews because I never read reviews before I actually watched the film. I should
probably stop mentioning this in interviews so this dude doesn't think he's as important. But I just find it so funny and ridiculous that someone like him has a platform, because it's like, but he's mimicking something that reinforces the reason why I make films, because we need other lenses and other POVs to counter some of the stuff that people have been conditioned to believe. So Aisha's, she's grappling with that conditioning, but she's also grappling with what she can see and feel and taste with her own body. And I'm always intrigued by the spiritual realm intersecting with realism, because the writers, Toni Morrison is one of my favorite writers, and she's constantly talking about the magic being very real and the ways that as we grow up, we're conditioned to move away from that very real magic. So those are some of the things that I was thinking about with Aisha.
And I'm wondering now, and I was wondering throughout the film, because I've also been conditioned to expect that any supernatural element in a horror film is bad.
Yeah.
Is the supernatural in Nanny inherently bad?
No, of course not. And you know what? It's what I love about pre-colonialist. I don't even want to frame it like that. What I love about African folklore and spiritualism is that it's always been complicated. It's always been not black and white or white, but somewhere in the middle. Every god, every spiritual representative has been a figure that represents the gray area. How do you fight how do you dismantle the master's house? You burn it down. It's the only way. You have to burn it down and start from scratch. And so that's why I love figures like Anansi, which I find it interesting that he's consistently he in all of the literature because he's chaotic. He's a chaos agent, and I don't know what they're saying about, male energy by calling him a he, but he definitely is complicated. And I love chaos trickster figures because they challenge us to step outside of the confines of the societies that we're navigating and really imagine a different reality.
And just to wrap up, because I think I've taken up enough of your time.
This is what happens when I'm with an actual engaged, smart, brilliant person.
I did want to ask you kind of to wrap up. It is momentous that Nanny won the Grand Jury Prize at Sundance for multiple reasons.
Right.
But I think it's really interesting what it says about the place of horror in film culture at the moment. And I wanted to ask you your thoughts about, perhaps now with some distance, kind of, what do you think it says about where horror is in how we perceive kind of and how we engage with film at the moment?
It's exciting. I'll even mention someone like Ari Aster, it's exciting to see Babadook, Jennifer Kent. It's exciting to see the ways that horror is being used to discuss family, generational trauma, grief, loss, very universal feelings that we all have, no matter how you couch it or what protagonist you have. And I don't think it's a coincidence that there is a renewed interest in the genre as we navigate multiple pandemics, empires falling apart before our eyes, the changing of the shift in power, social media taking on a life of its own, once marginalized people having a voice on platforms like social media. It's just, there's a lot, climate disaster, like I could keep going. There's a lot that feels like it is happening simultaneously that is really dark, but also pointing to a future that inherently has to be better. And so I am revolutionarily optimistic. I am cautiously optimistic, but there's resistance in the optimism that I have about something better being on the other side of this. And horror is a way that we are actively making sense of what we're navigating in real time. So I'm excited that a genre that I love, that I think is so perfect for making social commentary, has a renewed spotlight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's such a beautiful note to end on.
That was so good.
Thank you.
This one is gonna be, when I'm 60, people are gonna be digging this one back up.
I miss you.
Love you, Mommy.
Say bye-bye.
Bye, Mommy.
Anna, it's such a pleasure to meet you. And congratulations on this film, which, you're in almost every single frame of.
Yeah.
So I wanted to start with the beginning and ask you, do you remember your first impressions of the script when you first read Nanny?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm really excited. By the time I got Nanny, the industry that I'm in had been really abuzz about it for about a year. Everyone was talking about this script. It was on the blacklist, which is like this, do you know that? Yeah. And so I was just really excited that it finally reached my inbox and I could read it. And I read it and I got it. I was like, this is why everyone has been obsessed with this script. And I was moved by it. It made me very emotional because the story of Aisha is very parallel. It's very similar to my mother's story.
Mm-hmm.
She's an immigrant,
mm-hmm.
and she brought me to the States when I was 5 years old. And she did it for the same reasons Aisha is doing this incredibly difficult thing and leaving her son, which is to build a better life for her son and for herself, because there wasn't much for her there either. So for me, it was just so deeply personal, and I was really excited about the prospect of possibly playing this role.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it really means a lot hearing you say that, because I'm a child of immigrants too. My parents also emigrated and brought me over.
High five, immigrant children. Yes.
We did good.
We're doing all right,
Also moved over when I was about 5 or 6 from a country that no longer exists and to Spain. So I wanted to kind of ask you, and perhaps you've already answered it, but if you could deepen it a little bit about your entry point into Aisha, kind of how did you, when you knew you had the role, how did you approach making her your own, kind of building your performance?
Well, yes, my mother was a huge inspiration, and not only an immigrant, not only a mother, but also a domestic worker, and also specifically a nanny. So I had a lot of experience of Aisha through my mom. outside of that, because Aisha obviously isn't exactly my mother, I just did the character work that I always do for any role. I wrote a very extensive biography for Aisha. I meditated on a lot of what it means to be a mother. I'm not a mother, but I've been loved very wonderfully by a very wonderful woman. And my mother's love for me and for my brother, it's very potent. Like it's always like I can feel it. She cares so much and she holds so much hope and joy in herself for us. And so I thought about that. I thought about what that must feel like to kind of have your heart living outside of you and in the world. And, but yeah, I also, one thing that I did for this film that I haven't done for any other project is I created like I bought these cork boards and I bought a bunch of cards. What are these called? Flashcards?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And I bought pink ones and blue ones. And the pink ones, I wrote out each and every scene of the film and I put them all up in sequential order.
Yes.
But the scenes where Aisha's experiencing psychosis or neurosis or madness or insanity, I put in blue. And that just helped me, for one, look at all the cork boards and kind of see the ascension that she has into madness. And also because we're filming out of sequence, every day I could look at, okay, we're doing scene 4, 19, 64, and 17. And so I could see where Aisha is in each of those places and see how much madness or stress or confusion she's just come from. And that kind of informed my performance in that scene. So just so that it was consistent in the edit.
Like an emotional map for yourself.
Like an emotional map. Exactly.
And I want to ask you about this, the madness or the psychosis or the anxiety that Aisha goes through the film, which I felt so viscerally, not just through the direction, but also through your performance. Can you talk a little bit about the horror of Nanny? Kind of how did you wrap your head around performing these almost magical, but also very anxiety-inducing and ridden scenes?
Yeah, I mean, for me, ever since reading it, the true horror of Aisha is contending with the ache of missing her son and the mental torment of, did I make the right decision? Is he okay? Will he resent me forever? What will life be like here? Like, just the level of confusion and anxiety and, again, just ache of missing her child, to me, was the heart of the horror. And so everything that came, everything else came from there. So all of the actual horror elements that are very obviously horrific and scary and all those things came from a place of just this mental kind of torment, an emotional torment of, did I make the right decision? Is he going to be okay? Am I going to be okay? Is this the right thing? How am I going to last here without him? Everything that I did came from that place. Like, every moment of horror was informed from that place. Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit about your own personal relationship with horror films? Like, is this a genre that you gravitate towards, or is this something that you hold at arm's bay but then end up working in horror films?
It's actually something I hold at arm's bay. It's not something that I've always been necessarily attracted to, though I do enjoy going to the theater with friends and watching a horror film. Like, there's just something about like all the feels that it gives you, all the jumps, all the, it's a fun social thing to experience to me. But I think horror is attracted to me. This is my 4th horror project, and they just keep casting me in this. I don't know if it's something about something about me that's presenting as someone that exists in horror space, but apparently, and I'm glad for it. It's the horror projects I have done have also been very intelligent, have also had very nuanced and complex and interesting characters. So I'm here for it. But it's attracted to me, horror. It seems like, I don't know why.
and kind of on the note of people enjoying it collectively, have you had any, or actually I should say, what have been some of the most moving for you or exciting responses to Nanny that you've seen since the film premiered at Sundance and then obviously won the award and then has been, been shown around?
Yeah. What are some of the most exciting responses? We hear all sorts of stuff, really. Gosh, a lot of people really like to speak about the relationship between Amy and Aisha and the experience of motherhood. So that's been a really interesting conversation to have with people. A lot of people are just really taken by the visual aspects of Nanny, the lighting, the cinematography, the shots. I hear people talk about the soundscapes, like, so there's just so many elements that I find people are gravitating towards. But ultimately, what I'm hoping people take from the film is a deeper empathy for these people that are living amongst us, that are housekeepers or nannies or gardeners or immigrants that are coming and doing domestic work. And I hope that they gain a deeper appreciation for these people. These are very oftentimes intelligent, courageous people. It takes a lot of courage to leave your home country to try and dare to make a life somewhere else. And so I hope people gain a better, a deeper empathy towards these individuals. But yeah, it's been a really fascinating, cool thing to see how people respond to this film.
I mean, I think it's one of the most fascinating things for me personally to see how people respond to horror films at that time and later on.
Yeah.
And on that note, one of the things that I responded to a lot about Aisha is her sense of isolation because of that weight that you were talking about that she's carrying throughout the entire film about things that happen later on. But I wanted to ask you kind of, is that something that you were very aware of? Is that something that you wanted to really tap into, the sense that even when she's around other people, be that, her employers or other people around her, that she's always feels like she's by herself, like she's carrying this enormous weight of everyone else on her shoulders?
Wow, that's such a gorgeous question. One of the first things that struck me after reading the script and thinking about this character was how incredibly lonely she must be. And even, there's a scene where Aisha talks to her friend Saleh in the braiding salon, and you kind of get insight into her life back home. And there's a scene where she talks to Adam when they're at the cafe eating, and she talks a bit about her life back home. Even back home, she was someone that didn't quite fit in either. She's very intelligent, very independent, and very not wanting to go with the status quo and go with what was being given to her. And so she makes the decision to go leave and try to build a better life, again, for her son, but also for herself. And people I find that are like that in life, that are forward thinking, that are independent, that are intelligent at that level, are often very lonely. And on top of that kind of inherent loneliness of her, she moves to a foreign place, has no family. The person that she cares for the most is also an ocean away. And so it was one of the things, that really struck me was her incredible loneliness. But there's also a lot of joy in her, right? And she expresses that too in the film, which I think is beautiful. But it was one of the things I personally relate to. I know what it is to be alien, to be someplace that's new. Again, I'm an immigrant, so I get that experience and I get the loneliness that comes with that. But that was something I thought about a lot. Yeah, but we don't play our loneliness, right? We move through life and we...
Yeah, which is, and I think there's I think it's very difficult to write loneliness for the screen, which is why I wanted to ask you particularly about it, because I think it comes down a lot to performance and choices you're making in every scene, because it's right there in front of us, but she's never going to say it.
Right.
She's never going to tell anyone, no matter how close she is to them, I feel lonely or I'm isolated or this particular thing, because it just builds, doesn't it?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Just yes.
Yeah.
It's so intelligent what you're saying. It's so true.
It's felt. I think it comes, the thing that I'm mentioning is, it's not going to be original. It's just felt through the film.
Yeah.
I definitely felt it.
Yeah. I'm so glad, because it was something I thought about a lot. And, as an actor though, you think about the character, you do all the tedious scene work and all the stuff, and then you just have to let it go, and you just really hope that it shows up. And I'm glad that it did. Thank you for that. That's also Nikyatu's directing and the way that I think she shot certain things. Even very specific choices that you can really feel her isolation and her loneliness.
And I wanted to ask you, perhaps like jumping off from the loneliness into Aisha's relationship with magic, which comes up literally in a couple of scenes in the film. And I find that it, and she's not a person who necessarily believes in this stuff and kind of keeps it sort of at arm's length, respects it, but doesn't engage. And I wanted to ask you kind of, how do you think, when stuff starts happening to her, some of it feels terrifying and some of it also feels, because of the way it's shot, kind of beautiful in a weird, eerie way. What do you think her relationship with everything that's otherworldly is?
I approached all of those elements of horror and supernatural experiences from Aisha's mindset, which I just decided was a very grounded and logical mindset. I think for the first several times these things are happening to her, she's chucking it up to being exhausted. And she's at this new job and she's exhausted and she's overworked and she's not thinking clearly. And so she's trying to kind of rationalize these experiences until it gets to a point where they become so real that she can't do that anymore. And then you see her leaning on Kathleen's character. Leslie Uglim's character, Kathleen, to try to understand what is happening to her. But yeah, I just try to approach it just from a very grounded, logical place, because I think that's what Aisha would do. Yeah. I mean, what happens if you pop up in a pool and you see a mermaid and it's trying to, like, how does one respond to that? And what does one chuck that to,
And how did you, like, perhaps on the actual days, I know the film was shot kind of during the height of COVID restrictions and all of this, and I imagine it was particularly tough because of that. How do you approach the actual reality of shooting scenes like some of the ones that we see here, the underwater scenes, the getting kind of almost drowned in her own bed? They are nightmarish, but I wonder kind of what were they like for you to shoot those scenes of sheer terror and not knowing what's happening?
I had to just play the confusion of it. And in this film, it's confusion to the point of terror. And when you're really that confused about what's reality and what's not, that is a terrifying experience. To really be out of one's own mind and not be able to discern anymore, I imagine, is a terrifying thing. And so I approached it that way. But the actual physical experience of shooting it was also, challenging. The pool we shot in YMCA, in this pool that was there, the water was freezing, the space felt like chlorine, it was super hot, everyone was just really trying to get through it. But yeah, there were certainly like logistical challenges in filming these moments, but emotionally I just try to approach it as I try to explore what is confusion and what does confusion look like in this moment. And when you're experiencing these otherworldly experiences, that is a kind of confusion most of us will never know. So I just try to imagine what that's like and play that, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know we're running out of time, so I wanted to ask you about some of the lighter parts of of a very dark film.
Yeah.
Kind of how important was it, or kind of did it feel important to lighten all the terror and the otherworldly with the very, very beautiful love story that also happens again, also magically to Aisha in this big, this big bad city that is New York.
Yeah.
That something good can happen.
I could not have imagined how grateful that I could be for that part of the story until we started filming, because I was spending so much of my time all day, every day, again, in this state of confusion and terror and loneliness and depression and aching and longing. And then the days that I would have a scene with Sinqua and be able to shoot these scenes were like levity. It was so nice. And he became like, whenever, the night before each day, I'd take a look at next day's schedule and I'm like, oh, tomorrow's a Malik day. Amazing, amazing. Oh my gosh. Thank you, Lord. So much levity it gave me. And it gives the film too. It's this unexpected, like you said, experience of joy and love and romance in this otherwise really dark space. And so Anna was deeply grateful for that. Aisha, deeply grateful for that too. Yeah.
I was conditioned when he shows up. I was conditioned by all the other horror films I've seen and know and love to expect the worst from him. I was like, he's going to do something bad.
Yes, totally.
He's going to be terrible.
Totally.
And then, I don't think this is a spoiler. I think this is a good thing for people to know. He is not a wrong one.
Yes, exactly. I know. Thank goodness. Yeah, for sure.
Anna, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate your performance and your work in this film.
Thank you so much. Thank you.